In ancient Hebrew, there are a number of words for sin, and they talk about sin. Two of the words, the first one is hata'at. And hata'at literally means missing the target with a bow and arrow. And you can visualize that. You're aiming for the target, and you just miss hata'at, and you pick up an arrow, and you try again. It's a wonderful image of sin, really. And these are more unintentional sins. These are what we would call venial sins. Sins that we commit, but we might not necessarily have malice in our heart. We just committed it. Another word at the other extreme of that, though, is asham. It almost sounds like a shame. And asham means rebellion. Asham means that I believe in God, and I know God's commandments, but I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. And that is rebellion. Almost if you think of a parent-child relationship, and the child loves the parents, knows their rules, but makes a choice at some point to do otherwise. That they know everything that the parents want, they love their parents, they recognize them, but they decide, I want this for me. That's a sham, that's rebellion. And so when we hear in Chronicles about this whole story of exile, the Israelites are taken into exile, it's because of a sham. That they literally rebelled against God. It's not that they sinned here and there and they missed the mark. They decided, no, we are not going to follow the statutes. We're not going to do these things unless there's something in it for us. And so they're taken into exile for many years, during which time they finally face up to what it was that they did. And they kind of reaffirmed their devotion to God, reaffirmed the covenant. And at that moment then, Cyrus the Persian comes to power, and God works through Cyrus. And not only does Cyrus say, go back to Jerusalem, go back to your promised land, but also I'm going to give you money to build a temple and to reestablish yourself. When Jesus says to Nicodemus, as the serpent was lifted up in the desert, this refers back to, the time that the Israelites were in the desert. And they rebelled against God even there. They said, oh, would that we were back in Jerusalem, or would that we were back in Egypt. At least we had something to eat there. All we have is this wretched manna to eat. And so God sent seraph serpents among them, and many of them died because of this. So they cry out to Moses. Moses cries out to God. God says, take a bronze serpent and mount it on a pole. And anyone who looks at this will be healed. Just on a side note, I'm glad sometimes that the secular world doesn't read Scripture, because they would know that those ambulance symbols or hospital symbols sometimes of that serpent on the pole is from the Bible. But don't tell them, because then they'll take it down. Anyway, so anyone who looks at the serpent on the pole will be healed. Why? Because that serpent on the pole represents their sinfulness. It represents their rebellion. And so if they look at the sign of their rebellion, they acknowledge that they rebelled against God, and it shows that they want to be back with God, then they will be healed. It first takes acknowledging the sin. And once we acknowledge the sin, then we can be healed. And you know, there were some Israelites in the desert who refused to look at that serpent because they were stiff-necked. And they said, no, I'm not going to give in. I'm not going to look at the serpent. And they died. Because ultimately God is in charge of them. So go back to the gospel today. And what Jesus is saying to Nicodemus is, just as that serpent was lifted up, so will the Son of Man be lifted up. In other words, he's creating a bit of an equality here, that Jesus is the serpent on the pole for humanity. Why is this? Because his pierced body represents our sinfulness. St. Paul will say, he who knew no sin became sin for us. That Jesus on the cross represents our rebellion, our asham. And if we can look at that crucifix, which is why in the Catholic Church it's important that we have a crucifix and not simply a cross. We look on the crucifix and we see the reason we needed redeemed. Our own rebellion. That we look on him whom we have pierced. Now this gospel for today, sometimes you'll see a bumper sticker that says John 3:16. That's this one for today. And John 3:16 says, God so loved the world that he sent his only Son into the world, not to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. I think the bumper sticker should really read John 3:16-21. Follow. Because if you listen to that whole gospel, he goes on to say, those who do not wish to be saved, those who do not believe in the Son of Man or believe on the Son of Man, are already condemned. Now, Jesus doesn't say, I will condemn them. He says they're already condemned. In other words, they have rebelled, but they refuse to look at the serpent on the pole. They refuse to acknowledge their sin. Can you imagine someone who has cancer, but they don't want to acknowledge the cancer? They're in denial of that. Well, they can't go on perpetually in that state and live. It doesn't, they're going to die ultimately. So they go to the doctor, and the doctor will say, you have cancer. That's not a judgment on them. That is a fact. You have cancer, and we are going to cure this. In the Catholic Church, we have something called confession, reconciliation. That's exactly what it is. First, to come to reconciliation, we have to look on the serpent. We have to look on the one whom we have pierced. We have to acknowledge that we all sin. We have to. And once we can acknowledge that, the Lord wants to heal us through that. Now, could I confess my sins directly to God and have him forgive them? Absolutely, God can do anything. But where's the humility in them? We didn't look at the serpent on the rod. We just kind of said, God, do this for me. To acknowledge our sinfulness, to see the sickness we have in ourselves, and admit that to another human being, that's the clincher. And in that is where we get that true freedom. Because our sin not only affects our brothers and sisters, but it hurts God. And we think it's God, all-powerful, all-knowing, impenetrable, but it does. It hurts God's heart that we rebel against him. So to be able to come back into that covenant, Benedict XVI in Deus Caritas has said, to say we love our neighbors alive, we do not love God. So our sinfulness hurts our neighbors. It does. I mean, sometimes directly, you literally hurt your neighbor. But I would say even those sins we do in private hurt our neighbor. How can that happen? They don't even know we're sinning. But we act different when we're in a state of sin. We speak different. We engage differently. It's as if your friend has a cold, and they're not giving you the cold, they're not passing it on to you, but you know that you're not yourself. Something's different about them. And sin does have that effect on us. Even the private sins certainly affect God, but they can affect others. I want to show you how this works. Sometimes, at least for me, if I get a concrete example, it kind of seals it in my head. So when we talk about how our sinfulness and our actions affect not only our brothers and sisters, but affect God and why we need that forgiveness. So I have this little face, this apathetic smiley face. It's neither sad nor happy. But this represents our neighbor. And when we sin against our neighbor, we hurt them. And regardless of where it hits, it's going to hurt, and it's going to leave a mark. The responsibility is on us to try to repair this relationship. You know as well as I do, somebody could say something to you at the beginning of the day, and it's negative, and it just overshadows the whole day. And you try to be happy, you try to get out of it, and it's really hard. In the same respect, they could say something overwhelmingly good, and then it's really hard to get in a bad mood, because that was so overwhelmingly good. But sometimes I think what we don't see is the fact that we hurt our neighbor also really hurts God. And to look at that serpent on the pole is really to take a close look at when we sin against our neighbors, and even in privately, at the one who we really hurt in the long run. And that's this one. Now, if this is the end of the story, it's tragic and horrible. As St. Paul would say, if that's the end of the story, if we are not redeemed or redeemable, then we're the most pitiable of people. reconciliation, so that we can look at the sins that we have committed, both against our neighbor publicly and maybe against God privately in a way, and we can get forgiveness for that. And if we get forgiveness for that, and everything is new, then we can go live our life. We don't have to carry that stuff around. I know sometimes it can be very intimidating, and it can be scary. I mean, I have to go to confession as well. And we might think, well, the priest is going to judge me. The priest is supposed to act in the person of Christ, who simply wants to excise the tumor. And it may take a little chemo or radiation, to help. That's the priest's job. I'd encourage you, if you know anyone who has been to me for confession, ask them how it was. And if they say it was horrible, I'll be surprised. Or if they said it was difficult or intimidating or judgmental, I'd really be surprised by that. Because I do try to make it as easy as possible, because I myself have to go to confession. If we can take that step and look at the serpent on the pole, if we can look at Jesus and realize that it is him whom we pierced with our sinfulness, then we not only repair the relationship that we have with our brothers and sisters in Christ, and where we hurt them and hopefully didn't scar them too much, but we also come to find out that the one who could raise the dead and exorcise demons and cure the blind can also become holy and make us whole as well. It says in Revelation, "Behold, I make all things new." I think we get the picture. I hope we get the picture. As I've done in previous weeks, after Mass today, I'll take off the microphone, don't worry. And then I go right over to the meditation chapel. And I encourage you to seriously consider that. Take all the stuff that may have been there for 10, 15, a long time. You get rid of it. Leave it